Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. Welcome to Unless, the podcast, inspired by that Dr. Seuss quote from the Lorax that reminds us of the role we can each play in making the world a better place. Join Dr. Hemma Lomax and her guests as they share incredible stories of being moved to decisive action and perseverance, leading to tangible impact at scale. This podcast is a production of Corporate Compliance Insights.
There's this folktale, Indian folktale about blind men that are touching an elephant, and what they think an elephant is varies vastly depending on which part of the elephant their hands are on. So one is touching the flank and says, oh, an elephant is like a wall. And one is touching an ear and says, no, the elephant is like a fan. And one is touching the tusk and says, no, an elephant is like a spear, And I felt like that's where we were with ESG when we first started talking about it, because some people thought it was just net zero commitments and other people thought it was philanthropy and community activism, and other people thought it was DEI. And so I think what we're trying to do is to have a holistic view of this terminology, what is responsible investing, and an understanding that it may be a different approach that is most useful for different organizations within the portfolio. Because what we don't want to do is check some general box. We want each company to devote their resources to an area where they can make the most difference, whether that's in risk mitigation or value creation. But there's limited resources, just like compliance programs, right? You're always doing your risk assessment to figure out what's in that upper right-hand corner where, because you don't have unlimited resources, right? You have to start somewhere. And I think doing materiality assessments for responsible investing is similar. You need to look at what are the interests of your most important stakeholders, whether that's your employees or your customers or its regulators, and then what is the mission and the values of your organization, and what are your strategic plans, and what ends up in that upper right-hand corner that's important to you and important to your stakeholders, so that we can try to make the most judicious use of our resources to make forward progress for each company. And granted, there will have to be some things that are generally applicable that may feel a little check the boxy, because that is the nature of regulation sometimes, or you may have certain important stakeholders that really need you to do something because of their commitments that might not be your first priority if you had it completely up to you. But I think the more you can try to do that materiality assessment and focus where you're going to make the most impact, I think that's our goal, is to make it an authentic exercise for our portfolio.
That's Melanie Sponholz, Chief Compliance Officer and Director of Responsible Investing at Waud Capital Partners and a Professor at Fordham Law. And I am Dr. Hemma Lomax. Welcome to Unless, the podcast. Melanie is the Chief Compliance Officer and Director of Responsible Investing at Waud Capital Partners, or WCP. In Melanie's compliance role, she serves as a strategic resource to the firm's healthcare portfolio companies to support the mission of creating and maintaining a strong culture of ethics and compliance within WCP-affiliated entities. Prior to joining WCP, Melanie served as Chief Compliance Officer at BioSquip, Home Solutions, and Fox Rehabilitation. She is also a professor at Fordham Law and a frequent speaker on healthcare compliance. Melanie elevates the compliance profession by mentoring and creating networking and development opportunities for her team and others in the field. In recognition of her outsized role in this space, Melanie was named by Compliance Week as the 2024 Compliance Mentor of the Year. Melanie, welcome to Unless, the podcast, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Hemma, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm just looking forward to chatting with you.
Well, I always love sitting down and chatting with you, so I'm grateful that we get to share you with our listeners today. I'd like to start always with your origin story and ask you what inspired you. So let me give you a moment to introduce yourself and maybe explain to us how you got to the role you're in today.
Okay, so my friends will know, and they are sick of hearing about my analogy of the great Plinko board of life. And it also, if you are of a younger generation, you probably have no idea what I'm talking about. So there was this show back in the day called The Price is Right. And one of the games that the contestants played was this Plinko game, where to win a prize, you walked up a staircase on this giant pegboard, and you would drop your chip into this giant pegboard. And at the bottom were slots that had all different prizes, cash or trips or whatever. And you had to watch as your chip kind of bounced its way around, and you'd put it in on the upper right-hand corner, but it could end up in any slot at the bottom, depending on which peg it hit on its way down. So I kind of feel like my career has been a Plinko board. I guess it's not entirely random, because I certainly feel like I've made intentional choices, but I think the pegs maybe are the different people you meet and the different opportunities that come your way that you could not have predicted. Right. And so even though you thought you knew where your chip was going to end up. So I was in college, I was an English major, an English literature major. I thought I would be either a writer or maybe an actress, because I had the very useful minors of theater, French, and religion. So I am living proof that you can have an English, theater, religion, French combo undergrad and still turn out to be a productive, employed human being. But so I stuck my chip into the game, and I worked at Random House as an editor for a few years after college. I think one of the big pegs I hit was volunteering at a hospital in New York City where I was working. And I loved that experience. It was just a very moving, I connected with that experience. I loved being with people constantly, feeling helpful or useful. I loved that setting. And so I decided to go back to school. So that's a very simplified version of like a very existential period of questioning in my life. But I decided to go back to school. I originally thought maybe med school. So I did a post-bac pre-med program and realized that given that I'd been working for a few years, if I continued down that path, I probably wouldn't be a working physician until I was close to 40. So again, pivot, have all the prerequisites. I became a physical therapist instead. So I went to Columbia's PT master's program, and I worked in that field for several years and loved that. I mean, I was a geriatric specialist, so I really love working with older adults, and I feel like I get on a soapbox about how we don't value them appropriately in our society, but I really did enjoy that. But I got pulled into management. So that begins. Now we're starting to go towards compliance. Okay, I'm getting there. So went into management, was an operational leader. And that was one of the hardest periods, I think, of my adult life, because I was a single mom at that time with three very young kids. And that job was a big job. I think I was managing somewhere around 30 different clinicians doing home care. And I was in charge of keeping all of our clients happy and keeping our clinicians productive. And I'd be putting my kids to bed and then be on my laptop until 1:00 in the morning. And I just realized that I didn't feel authentically connected. I feel like any job has stress, but I didn't want to be stressing out about whether someone was hitting their productivity numbers. Like it felt disconnected from the reason I had gotten into healthcare, which was like, I didn't really feel like I was helping anyone. I was helping meet the bottom line. I guess in some esoteric way, I'm still helping people because we were serving a geriatric population. So there was that connection, but it didn't feel close to me in that role. So this opportunity came up to come work in headquarters and oversee quality assurance and professional development for this organization. And it just felt like the right thing to do to take that position. And that was one of the best jobs I've ever had, in that I had this great dedicated team of PTs, OTs, and SLPs that were all focused on quality and outcomes. And that was my first, dip of the toe into kind of compliance related work, because we oversaw internal audit and did training and those elements. And because we were largely geriatric focused, as you might imagine, I think we were 98% Medicare in our payer mix. And so we got audited out the wazoo, right? Like if there was a day that an audit didn't come in, that would have been the unusual day. And we had great counsel and consultants that we worked with. And they said, really, your company, it's time for you to have a formal compliance program. You're doing lots of great things around quality and professional development, but you need a formal compliance program as a defense in this highly scrutinized area that you're in. And that is when I got voluntold to be a compliance officer, because QA was the closest thing anyone could think of to compliance. And they were like, oh, Melanie will do it. She'll be our compliance officer. And so that was big peg, right? And my chip went a different direction. I do still feel very authentically connected to outcomes and care in a compliance role. And I think there could be a lot of stress, as you know, with being a compliance leader, but somehow to me, it's a more worthwhile stress. And not to speak anything against people who are certainly doing really important things in other areas, but just for me, it felt more authentically me to focus on this area, and that I was willing to deal with the stress because I enjoyed the work. And I think I also enjoy not being what people expect in a compliance officer. And so that's kind of fun for me. That made it interesting for me. And I have empathy for clinicians and operators because I've been in their shoes. So anyway, it stuck. And so I moved out of the rehab world after a few years, took on a chief compliance officer role in home infusion, which was a big leap of faith because I knew nothing about home infusion when I took that role. And it was a private equity backed company, which I didn't even know what private equity was at that point. And then it just kind of picked up steam from there. And I stayed with home infusion for, I think, around 5 years. And then Waud Capital Partners found me because of my PT background, because they bought an outpatient physical therapy organization. And I started talking to them. And instead of ending up working at Ivy, I ended up coming in-house at UCP because they really saw the value of protecting their investments in healthcare by having strong compliance programs. And it's been 8 years now, almost. It'll be 2 weeks from now, it'll be 8 years. So that was a really long-winded answer to your question.
No, that's great. And there's lots I want to unpack in that. So lucky Plinko for us and for Waud Capital Partners for sure. And you already underlined this. I mean, there can be stress in jobs, but as you said, once you find something that's your passion and purpose, it's not that the stress goes away, but it just seems so much more manageable because you are purpose driven. So I love that you underline that. It's a good lesson for all of us to remember to find the purpose in what we're doing. And again, you mentioned this as well, but I want to underline it. Your experience in the operational space, operational management, it can be quite activity based. I know that it's important to you to be impact and outcome driven as well. So to understand the difference, as you said, to have been in it yourself, to have the empathy for those that are in that space, but also to know that you could have a greater impact if you were in this, as you said, quality outcomes and care as a triad, what you're looking at. So I really want to talk more about the quality outcomes and care piece, because I know from knowing you that you bring that into your work and you bring that into your strategic advice for the portfolio companies. Another way of putting it is a human-centered approach to these problems and looking for impact at scale. So really love the Plinko analogy, but also each of those pegs was meaningful, I think, as you tell me. Yeah, really, really great to hear that. And then you also mentioned, and I wanted to pick this up with you, the unexpected compliance officer. I've heard you mention that phrase before, and I totally identify with that. I love it.
Yeah.
But I'm going to ask you to explain that a little bit more, because you and I know what you're talking about there. But what do you mean by the unexpected compliance officer?
Well, I think there are a lot of people that, and I've heard other people come up with different names for compliance before, to try to get around the stereotype, right? Because I think there are a lot of people, depending on their professional backgrounds, who just hear the word compliance and it sends a chill down their spine. They think it's going to be, you always hear the cliches, the Department of No, or, or our whole overdone shtick about we're here to keep you out of jail, or, it just doesn't sound like a very engaging, collaborative, dare I say, fun department to interact with, right? And I think it can be all of those things, because if you are effectively engaged in your organization and you understand the strategic aims and the culture and the people that you're working with, I think you can be a collaborative, supportive, positive force in an organization. And so I just love to demonstrate. And sometimes you have people who have had great experiences with compliance, and all the better, because you get right off like a house on fire. But a lot of times you have people who have a little, maybe PTSD about compliance experiences. And so it's fun to go in and be a positive, be a little sunshine instead of a little rain,
I couldn't agree more. I mean, a lot of sunshine as opposed to huge storms climbs over us. And look, you said it's fun and it's disarming. We enjoy it. Yeah, you and I definitely enjoy that space. But also, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about why we're in that space. So even though it's fun and we can make jokes about it, I say #compliance sucks. Whatever it is. Yeah. It's actually a real thing, right? And I want us to really think about, maybe I can get your advice on this. How are we going to change that at scale? So it's nice to have like one or two of us saying we want to be more fun and using our power and being a force. I think you said it yourself. There's a force here that's needed, and we're getting in our own way if we don't become the compliance officer that you just described. So what are your thoughts on that? What advice have you got to scale this across the profession? And what gets in the way? Why do we do that? Why do we come across as the police or the office of no?
Oh boy, there's a lot to unpack.
Sorry, that was a lot of questions.
Yeah. And a couple of things come to mind. One is that instead of looking at it, we always talk about, it's a struggle because compliance is seen as a cost center. And, I've spoken with Nick Gallo and Gio Gallo a number of times on how to demonstrate the return on investment of compliance. First of all, I think we can come up with a legitimate counterpoint to the argument that we're a cost center. But I also think that there is kind of this secret superpower in your cost center position that we're in, because what we also are or can be is kind of the confidant or the neutral party that can be a trusted advisor to our executive team, because we aren't shooting for a number or a volume or a P&L in the same way. We are uninterested in that way. We're detached in that way, so that we can give trusted advice as someone who interacts with everyone across the company and has this really great vantage point to understand the culture of a company. And you can come to us for advice, and we're not in it for ourselves. If you can establish yourself in that role, I think you can really be seen as a valuable asset in that role. And you couldn't be that if you also were trying to drive budget numbers. So there is, I think, a distinct advantage in that.
I really agree. The other thing I think is we bridging the gap between the regulators and our boards and our management, or the employees and our boards and our management. And those are two very different roles, right? It's one thing. I'm trained as a lawyer. Maybe I'll think a lot about the laws and give a fully informed choice about the laws and legal compliance. But actually, culture is much more than that, much more. And the integrity and ethics piece means we've got to think about getting the information from the employees. There's being confidence there, and then giving fully informed decisions or decision useful information to those above us. And I think you do that really well. I think the balance of being able to give people ease and peace of mind when it comes to their day job, but also keep abreast of the regulatory developments. I think we have to toe that line carefully, because spending too much time on the regulators is all about the fear and the yawn and the eye roll. But actually getting information from the operational part of the business is really, really critical here.
Yeah, I think it's always keeping curiosity at the forefront, and whether that's being curious about what the regulators are trying to accomplish, or how you can then translate those requirements in a way that highlights for whoever it is in your organization, whether it's leadership or employees. You need to find the what's in it for them, not just because they told you so. That doesn't, when is that ever connected with anyone from childhood, right on. Like when is, because I said so, when has that ever resonated and motivated? I just think that's the nuance. When I think back to like, why did I want to be a geriatric specialist as a physical therapist? I loved working in particular with the neuro patients, especially patients with dementia who had a CVA, because every situation was unique. There was no protocol. There was no, if you work in ortho and you have an ACL replacement, it's kind of like a recipe,
right?
That you do this in week 1 and you do this in week 3. But when you're working with someone, you could have two patients who both had a very similar medical diagnosis as far as they had a stroke in their right hemisphere or, temporal lobe, whatever it was, but they could present entirely differently. And what you needed to do to connect with them and help them, you had to be creative because there was no recipe, right? And I think compliance is like that for me as well, because our challenge is to take an audience who all have their own metrics to meet and goals to achieve, and what you're trying to communicate can easily be seen as a speed bump or an impediment to meeting those goals. But how do you figure out for each of those audiences the way to communicate it and connect it to, and actually something you said, so Hemma spoke at an event we had in October. We do a compliance symposium. And I remember you talking, and I will probably get this all wrong, so just correct me. But I remember you talking about how compliance is the brakes, but like the brakes on a car in a good way, so that if you're a race car and you're trying to win a race and you're speeding around this track, if you don't have appropriate use of your brakes, you will literally fly off the track. Physics will make you fly off the track at some point if you don't know how to brake appropriately on the bank, on the curve, to stay on the track. And so you need those effective brakes. And like, that's how I feel like, I connect with that concept, because that is what makes compliance interesting, and how you make it not the dreaded Department of No is by figuring out how to make that light bulb go on for someone that, like, yes, Hemma is trying to help me win this race by keeping my car on the track.
Correct. Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up. I actually heard that from Felipe Maldonado at, I think it was SCCE. He's at Salesforce as a compliance director. We share these anecdotes with each other because, again, they make sense. And again, it makes me think, we have this concept in compliance of the ride along, where if you don't understand the business, you should go in and understand the business, so you grasp what really the decision makers are dealing with, right? It's very hard to do a checklist in the situation you describe. You don't really need to ride along because you were actually riding yourself.
But every new business is a new ride along. I mean,
Correct.
Every business is unique, and every executive team is unique. And maybe that's part of the rut that people get into as well, is like, you've met one executive team.
Yeah.
It's not,
Well, that's it. And again, one of the challenges I think we have as compliance professionals is to have systems that are scalable and repeatable and can apply to hundreds of thousands of employees across global multinationals. But we mustn't lose sight of the skills building part of that, rather than the diktat or the, you must do this in a certain way. As you talk about the geriatric care, my mother was a nurse, and she worked in nursing homes at the end of her career. And I used to volunteer sometimes with her. And so I have a very similar experience where I could see this in action and understand what you've just said viscerally, which is there is no checkbox here. I mean, the checkbox might say give medication at a certain hour, but the situation presented in front of you is very different. And I can understand the frustration from having, a compliance officer up on high telling you to do this, but it just doesn't match the operational reality of what you've got in front of us. So back to your word, curiosity at the forefront, we really do need to make sure that we are equipping our employees to make decisions in the moment. And that's a skills thing, really, right? It's not often a policy diktat. Most of the time we ask people to come back and ask us, but really what we need to do is equip people to make the decisions themselves at scale. So no, I love that. And again, really important, like you said, the concept of the ride along, however that might look in your particular business, is really important, because that shows ongoing curiosity. And not only that, the perceptions piece, like you said, we talked about, there's a perception of compliance. You can disarm that at scale just with some curiosity, just with some humility, and maybe an acknowledgement that you can't possibly know, but you're interested in knowing. I think that will go a really long way. So I love seeing that you do that. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you do when it comes to supporting the portfolio companies? Because I think your role is very unique, even in the PE space. It's not common to have a chief compliance officer that's really designed and designated to the compliance functions of the portfolio. So please explain that a little bit to us. What do you do by way of supporting them?
Yeah, I don't know of anyone else who has my job. And if anyone who hears this podcast has my job, please reach out to me, because I would love to connect with you. I span the whole life cycle of our investments, which is really interesting. So that would start with when the firm is considering investing, for instance, in a specific area of healthcare, contributing to the thought on that, from a regulatory standpoint, like what are the potential risks, or, what are we going to need to keep an eye on in that area? And, as that focuses in on a particular organization as an acquisition, helping to contribute to the scope of the due diligence that's done, to try to make sure that we're looking at assessing those risks as we're partnering with an organization. And then post-close is when I start working with the management teams of our portfolio companies. And we're a middle market private equity firm. So depending on the size and age and maturity of the company when we partner with them, it can really vary what I do. Some companies have a compliance program in place, and I'm a resource then to their compliance team, and we'll go in and do things like a program effectiveness review and try to lend a hand with risk assessment and whatever the needs may be, or wherever I can be helpful. On the other end of the spectrum, you may have a founder-led organization that is younger and has a less mature function, or has, like my first compliance officer job, we had a lot of elements of compliance, but not a formal program when I stepped into that first role. So in that case, I helped get that program started, get that party started. And that can look like a lot of things. It can be almost like an interim compliance officer for a short period of time, where I'll dig in with the diligence findings and do a risk assessment and talk to the leadership and talk to the board about a compliance work plan and a compliance program. But pretty quickly, part of that would be helping them find and hire their compliance leadership, because it's important that they have an internal team. So I wouldn't stay in that interim role for long. It would be more of a building exercise to get the right resources in place internally. And then I just stay involved over the course of our time with that company as a resource, as an advisor. I know you've come to we have a compliance forum where we've created a cross-portfolio network with all of our compliance and legal leadership, where we meet every Friday for an hour. Sometimes it's just talking, best practice sharing. Other times we have guest speakers like you, or a lot of other great folks have come to join us. Or if there's a key regulatory change or update, we'll have someone come talk about important hot topics at that meeting. And we get together in person once a year, which I know you joined us this year. We get together for 2.5 days, and we get all kinds of amazing speakers, and we try to really curate that content to be useful for compliance leaders in our industry, in the private equity industry. And it's branched out now. We have our HR folks get together. Now we do a cybersecurity summit once a year, and my colleague Shubha Lakshmanan does a monthly cybersecurity forum with our IT leaders. And I think it's just, I don't know about you, but I don't feel like I know many compliance people who have had a cast of thousands in their own organization, or have all the support they could possibly need. And so what we've created is, I know I'm biased, but I think it's a cool network where everyone has a phone of, like, many phone of friends now, and this shared resource group. And so we roll along with that, and we try to have transactional readiness. For instance, like when we talk about specific content for private equity compliance, you're going to transact at some point if you're a compliance officer at a private equity owned organization. In addition to all the other things that you would always have to do as far as building and maturing a program, you're going to need to have an open house at some point where people are going to come in and kick the tires on that program as part of an acquisition. So it's a whole other kind of vantage point you have to have. So we work together on all those issues. And then sadly, they move on to the other successful ventures after they partner with us. But we invite alumni to all of our events. Once in Waud Capital's compliance forum, you are always a member.
And I'm so glad to hear that, because I will hunger for that. I mean, look, it's mind-blowing to me that this is so unique, honestly, because it's so good. It makes so much sense. In fact, after meeting you, I think I was working at a portfolio company for another PE firm, and I insisted that I start to meet the CCOs in the other portfolio companies based on your model. I was like, wait, this is the thing. Melanie does this. Have you heard of Melanie? Let's do what Melanie does, because it makes so much sense. The economies of scale, the community, like you said. I actually want to go back a little bit, Mel, to what you said about the acquisition, pre-acquisition, post-acquisition, closed due diligence. I'm going to belabor that analogy of the car for a second. It's almost like you're helping the firm decide whether to buy this car. You're telling them whether they've got brakes or not, or the brakes are squeaky, or the brakes are last year's model. But you stay almost as a mechanic that helps diagnose, identify, price up the problem. I'm sure you price up the problem, and that helps the firm decide how to price the issues. And then, if they go ahead and acquire, you're still there coaching as a mechanic, holding hands and saying, let's get you to the better model. Let's put you on your journey. So that in itself, I just want to pause there, because that's phenomenal that the firm gets that service from you and your teams. Also, if I were a CCO in a portfolio company, how comforting not to be worried about the pre-acquisition due diligence process, but to know I've got someone like you coming in with a curiosity and ear to help me diagnose where I can improve, and again, help me price it up, help me maybe get the resources, and then give me a community of practice where I can continue to improve. Just that alone, that helping, I think, again, very unique, but much needed. And I hope that you start a movement here.
I hope so too.
Other PE firms take notice. I mean, again, we're going to talk about the provenance and the prominence of PE firms in the American economy in a minute. I want to get to that. So as the PE opportunity grows, so must the compliance function. So, this model is really, really good. And then again, back to what you said about creating this community of practice in the many ways that you do it. I know you said you do the weekly, you do the in-person events, you do the one at the symposium. I know from my own experience in this community of compliance professionals that it's a very warm, sharing, kind, supportive, generous community, but much better to have a community that's in the same portfolio, that's in the same industry. Again, many of us wonder what the PE firm is thinking when we're owned by it, but you don't have to wonder no more if you can all speak together and bustle. So that's another really good vantage point. And then I've met a number of the people, as again, you invited me to the forum, and I've seen how innovative they can be. So Margarita at Ivy, she won an award, innovation in GRC. And I'm sure she can take much credit for that, her and her team, but I don't doubt that she was bolstered by having you all to bounce ideas off. So really, really powerful. Now, the other piece, before we move on to the PE firms, the other piece I know that you are intimately involved in is responsible investing and ESG. So can you tell us a bit about your role when it comes to guiding WCP's ESG strategy, particularly as there may be some concern that ESG is about to die off? So what's happening there, and what is I know you might not want to talk about Waud specifically, and you can't talk for the whole industry, but what's your sense of the direction of ESG investing and responsible investing, and what we should expect to see from these firms going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting, I don't know if it's as hotly debated as it was a couple of years ago, but for a while at all the compliance conferences, there were these sessions about should compliance lead ESG or responsible investing. I feel like it's a very natural fit, because it is so much of it revolves around governance, really, right? The last thing you want to do is put responsible investing or ESG policies and strategy in place that don't match the culture of your organization, or that you can't authentically support and adhere to, right? So who better than compliance to be guiding that? Because that's what we always do, right? Is we're always trying to look at, what are the risks? what are the regulations, what is our business strategy and what aligns with that, and how do we pull that together to have this authentic, supportable governance structure that we can move forward with. And I think it's very much the same, whether you're building a compliance program or a responsible investing program. I think it's going to be a bumpy few years for ESG and responsible investing. I hope not a very long period of time, although I think what happens in the next few years can certainly have long, far-reaching implications in the United States. But I think we have to keep in mind that there is, which not all Americans do such a great job at, that there is this whole world outside of the United States. And I don't feel like the sentiment is similar elsewhere, especially if you look at the EU or Australia or Canada. There are a lot of people who are not slowing down or taking their foot off. Here we keep going back to the car, right? But taking their foot off the gas at all. And so I think it's going to take strategic leadership in responsible investing here in the United States, because you are going to be on a little bit of a tightrope between some of the kind of anti-ESG actions that may be going on here, but the fact that you have important stakeholders who still do have expectations around progress in that area. And encouragingly, I think that will keep things moving in what I consider to be the right direction. I think if your organization is doing business with any big international players, I think maybe your shift is going to move somewhat from regulatory forces, from governmental agencies, and more towards having to do things in order to do business with your upstream and downstream business partners. You'll still have to meet commitments based on those requirements. And states, it will be an interesting time here to see how you have the red, the blue, and the purple, and how state regulations are going to impact ESG. But it is not going to die. It's just going to the energy is going to get channeled in different ways to keep the progress moving forward, I think.
And that's a good way to look at it in terms of energy and how it's channeled, and that the energy is still going to be there. It's just the way we channel it. Even my question is a bit polarizing, the death of ESG. And I think one of the things that's incumbent on us also as builders of the culture is to not fall prey to the polarization. Right. And get back to your word of curiosity. There is probably some legitimate pushback against the plethora of regulations that are coming out when it comes to ESG. We'll have the same problem with AI soon, right? It's like, right. Privacy is already there. That we, as compliance professionals, shouldn't forget our role there, because we don't want to just say, oh, people don't care about the environment, people don't care about human rights. That's not what's being said. Right. Really, there's a pushback on us, the compliance professionals, and what we represent. And so I think it's a really good opportunity when we have a moment like this in history, where we can say, okay, let's sit down and see what unites us, because it's likely that there are some real behemoth problems that we'd all agree we'd like to solve. What comes to mind for me, and I'm biased on this, is due diligence questionnaires. So this idea of just questionnaire after questionnaire after questionnaire, as if that is impactful third-party risk management, which it probably isn't, right? And so
I think that's where you tie it back into being able to demonstrate that what's in it for them. When you talk about, say, ESG diligence, I mean, we found things doing ESG diligence that certainly can impact the value of a company or the reputation of a company or the quality of earnings of a company. It's not some weird niche, are they planting trees kind of exercise. There's so much that goes into what that bucket term ESG, that no matter what kind of organization you're looking at, there are going to be elements that are either risks or value creation opportunities for those organizations. So I think that's why we shifted from calling it ESG to calling it responsible investing, because we really feel like that's what it is, right? It's being responsible by looking at anything that could impact the long-term value of an organization that you're partnering with.
Yeah, no, and the terminology is important because it takes on a life of its own, but I love responsible investing. I've also heard you quote Mary Shirley before. When she goes to board, she says, what, so what, and what next? I've heard you quote her, and I love that. I took that because, again, in this space, you want to be able to persuade on the what, so what, and what next. Like, let's talk about what really matters to you, the business in front of me, versus what might be in the papers or what regulators might be talking about, because it really does have, like I said, value creation opportunities there. Just going to Waud, I think I read on their website that they are thinking about foregoing short-term thinking as opposed to long-term thinking. They really do care about responsible investing. We're going to talk about PE generally in a minute, but what can you say about Waud's strategy there for responsible investing and how important it is to have that as part of their strategy? I know just having you in your role is a good sign when it comes to Waud. Yeah. Beyond that, what can you say about their strategy for responsible investing?
I think it is being thoughtful and intentional. We spent a couple of years just learning a shared vocabulary around ESG, because I think the first year that I talked about it with at our annual meeting was, I guess, 3 years ago now. And I used the example, there's a Indian folktale about blind men that are touching an elephant. And what they think an elephant is varies vastly depending on which part of the elephant their hands are on. So one is touching the flank and says, oh, an elephant is like a wall. And one is touching an ear and says, no, the elephant is like a fan. And one is touching the tusk and says, no, an elephant is like a spear, And I felt like that's where we were with ESG when we first started talking about it, because some people thought it was just net zero commitments and other people thought it was philanthropy and community activism, and other people thought it was DEI. And so I think what we're trying to do is to have a holistic view of this terminology, what is responsible investing, and an understanding that it may be a different approach that is most useful for different organizations within the portfolio. Because what we don't want to do is check some general box. We want each company to devote their resources to an area where they can make the most difference, whether that's in risk mitigation or value creation. But there's limited resources, just like compliance programs, right? You're always doing your risk assessment to figure out what's in that upper right-hand corner where, because you don't have unlimited resources, right? You have to start somewhere. And I think doing materiality assessments for responsible investing is similar. You need to look at what are the interests of your most important stakeholders, whether that's your employees or your customers or its regulators, and then what is the mission and the values of your organization, and what are your strategic plans, and what ends up in that upper right-hand corner that's important to you and important to your stakeholders, so that we can try to make the most judicious use of our resources to make forward progress for each company. And granted, there will have to be some things that are generally applicable that may feel a little check the boxy, because that is the nature of regulation sometimes, or you may have certain important stakeholders that really need you to do something because of their commitments that might not be your first priority if you had it completely up to you. But I think the more you can try to do that materiality assessment and focus where you're going to make the most impact, I think that's our goal, is to make it an authentic exercise for our portfolio.
So it bears reminding that it's not a requirement to do any part of the elephant necessarily. The requirement is to have good governance around it and make disclosures that are true, but not materially false, right? So don't get too excited about eating the whole elephant, because if you say you're going to, the chances are you're going to have a material statement in your disclosure.
Right.
Again, belaboring the analogy, they say, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? And to your point, you need to prioritize with the materiality assessment. Now, that makes perfect sense. And then you mentioned just more generally, so the impetus then for that is really reputation and what the stakeholders care about, the investors care about. PE is having a moment, I think, when it comes to some backlash. Maybe it's not a moment, maybe it's nothing new, but I'm seeing at least 2 books that have the word plunder in the title when it refers to private equity. So I wanted to just talk to you about that a little bit, because again, I do think we have a role here as compliance professionals, and I'd love to hear what you think about that. And I know you and I have talked about how these firms, because they care about responsible investing and other things, they can be a force for good that care about the communities in which they operate. But juxtapose that with this idea that PE firms are just in it for the profit and plundering good businesses and laying people off. What's going on there? How does your role impact that debate, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, I think life is cyclical. We're the villain, current villain. We won't always be the villain. But I do sometimes feel like we should walk around with a scarlet PE on our chest. But I think a lot of the scrutiny has been around private equity and healthcare, which, let's be honest, we live in a country where healthcare is a business in a lot of cases, right? So, I mean, I can only speak to my own opinion. Clearly, like after all we've talked about today, I mean, we're trying to be good corporate citizens. We want to leave our companies better than they were when we partnered. So clearly, not all private equity is out there, trying to, get rid of this superfluous, do-gooding and make money. Like that's a generalization, and that's not true. And I think if you actually take a minute and look at all the press releases about enforcement actions and investigations that are out there, it's publicly traded companies and privately held companies and nonprofit companies. It's not like there's some preponderance of private equity companies, private equity backed companies that are out there that are the problem. I just think it's an easy target, right? Because, people fear that somehow the objective of providing good health care will somehow go off track because someone is too focused on making money. But you could say that about any for-profit organization. So I don't know that it is. I'm not sure exactly how we got the starring role as the villain right now, but I don't think that I think it's a broad generalization, and like any stereotype, I don't think it's very useful, because I think there's a lot of ways we could make American healthcare more efficient and protect patients. And like none of the ways that I could think of would be just targeting private equity.
Right. No, I think you're right. It can be an unhelpful stereotype, but also I think it can be very helpful to unpack it a little bit. Just like we were saying about ESG, right? It's not an elephant; it's got different parts, and there's something to look at in each of these things. I had the good fortune, as you said, of being in Chicago and meeting some of the partners at WCP, and one of them stepped up to me and said he couldn't do his job if he didn't have you. I think that was a lot to do with you, Melanie Sponholz, right? A lot. Also, he was saying that an integral part of his job was to have a chief compliance officer that kept him safe, made him feel like he had ease and peace of mind about the investments. And so I remembered that. I thought that was powerful because it said a lot to me about the priorities in his mind of, how to do his job. It wasn't just an afterthought. And oftentimes, again, the stereotype is we see compliance as an afterthought, a check the box, a must have because someone's told you to. I got the sense that at least that partner saw you as an integral and absolutely critical part of his work. So really, really good to say that. Now, another piece I wanted just to get your thoughts on is efficiency, because we mentioned that a little bit. One thing PE is famous for, whether for good or for worse, is bringing efficiency and systematic efficiency to the companies that it purchases and invests in. And again, the idea hopefully is you leave them better than when you found them. But some of that is efficiency. And we know from the last couple of years, efficiency can feel painful on the receiving end.
Yeah.
Also, there's a lot in the news right now about the new administration in the US creating a Department of Governmental Efficiency, DOGE. I think Elon Musk might be charged to lead that. So there's a lot of concern in the air about this word efficiency, as if, again, that were the villain. I'd love to get, again, your take, maybe a measured unpacking of this word efficiency. And what's your experience of the benefit that can be seen from an efficiency mandate?
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, I think I gained a lot of insight into this even before Waud, because I worked for a private equity-backed company. And I think we had a great CEO, and one of his favorite phrases was single repeatable model. Mm-hmm. So, we had this organization that had offices all over the country. And I think it's interesting because I actually think it's really healthy from both a compliance standpoint and an operational efficiency standpoint, where it is much harder to know where the risk is if you have, say, 20 offices and they're all operating completely differently. Then you don't know for sure where your risk lies. Whereas the more you can gain these efficiencies, everyone is using the same standard operating procedure. Everyone has the same, whether it's infection control approach, or they're all going to use UPS versus FedEx, or whatever the case may be. The more you can get that single repeatable model, first, you're going to have economic efficiencies, because if you had 5 different overnight carriers working for your company, are you really getting the best pricing? No, because you don't have that scale to get better pricing. And then from a compliance standpoint, how do you know if everyone has their own operating manual in their office, then you don't know if people have an understanding of how to report problems or the same understanding of how things should be done. But somebody coming in, and now also, tech is a big part of efficiency, right? So if you can come in and you have capital to invest in order to upgrade, the IT systems and the cybersecurity, and maybe implement things like a contract management system, or the things that a smaller organization wouldn't have the budget to do, that's where capital from private equity can come in and create some efficiencies that also I think are a great benefit from a governance standpoint, because you're creating a more standard model across the footprint of an organization. And even having the management skills and coaching to help a team bring an organization to that level. I think those are all great ways that capital can help an organization mature and gain those efficiencies that make it easier to scale and easier to run in an efficient way. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it really does. And as you're talking, I start to think, well, it's easy to fear change and, yearn for the status quo. But sometimes that's because we feel it's happening to us. And actually, I urge people to stay part of the conversation. Like we say, create the culture, don't consume it. Create the efficiency, don't consume it, right? Because we've all got, you're back to the point about people in the field having the best vantage point when it comes to compliance and risk. They also would have the best vantage point when it comes to efficiency or lack thereof. And if you can be in that conversation and set yourself apart as somebody that is willing to take the short-term pain of change for a longer-term efficiency. I mean, none of us want to be on repeat, all of us looking for vendors to do the same thing, a portfolio tech stack, which makes sense, for example. And again, back to your role, the idea of having an expert coach that has eyes across the portfolio, across the industry, can learn lessons in one part of the portfolio and scale that across as a proactive, preventative measure as opposed to reactive. There's no better definition of efficiency for compliance professionals. So no, I appreciate that, because again, don't want to be toxically positive, but sometimes we get caught up with the fear, the behemoth villain that is efficiency or PE. And we do need to unpack these and be curious as to what's actually happening.
Well, it's kind of like the same sentiment we're hearing about AI, right?
Yes.
You really think AI is eventually just going to replace human beings? I mean, there's the doomsday scenario where we all become obsolete, right? It's a similar sentiment, I think, to worrying about if private equity is going to come in and efficiency is seen as like the Grim Reaper or something, where it could be actually a much more supportive, empowering thing that frees up brain space to do more productive, more creative, innovative things, because you're bringing in some support systems to take on some of the things that can be just keeping the trains running on time.
Right. And then back to what we said at the top of the call about, then you can get closer to your impact, your care, your quality, as opposed to your activity, right? Like that works for all of us. So we all want to feel mission driven, values driven, and feel that we're having an impact, rather than on this kind of squirrel, what's that thing, this hamster wheel thing, not squirrel, the hamster wheel of just, activity after activity. So no, I agree with you. I want to look for the evidence of the exciting things that are coming, rather than looking for the things to worry about. Now, one last thing. I know we could go on all day and have multiple cups of coffee when we chat.
Yes.
But I mentioned again at the top of the call that you were awarded the Compliance Mentor of the Year accolade in 2024. So congratulations again for that. And I know firsthand how important it is for you to be building a professional community where you can pay it forward. I feel like you've paid forward to me. You've acted as an informal mentor in many ways. So I'm so grateful to you, Mel. But I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about why that's important to you and what you've been doing there, even outside the portfolio. I know you do a lot more than just within Waud. So.
Yeah, well, thank you. And right back at you, really. I mean, I think that's For me, actually, that's the secret of mentoring, is that it's a two-way street, because I feel like I learn in all of the interactions that I have with colleagues. And I sometimes am caught off guard by the perception that I'm mentoring, because I feel like I'm getting just as much out of that exchange, right? So it's kind of sneaky in that way. I just don't, plus I'm not old enough and grown up enough to be someone's mentor.
Well, obviously.
Really. No, obviously, I'm just, a kid myself. But no, I think it is really important. And I think we kind of talked about it earlier, but, especially in compliance, I was a lone ranger for a lot of my early career in compliance, where I didn't really have any colleagues within my organization. And I was really fortunate to cross paths with other more seasoned professionals who, as you mentioned, we have a very collegial group. People are very generous with their time and their energy. And I probably wouldn't have stayed in this career if that hadn't been the case, because I really met a lot of people along the way who were willing to spend time mentoring me and answering questions and being that phone call, whether it was just a sanity check or it was for real detailed advice. And also, we can't all be experts at everything, right? So having that, I think it's Lisa Fine who talks about having kind of like a pantry of mentors that
lovely.
Sometimes you need the cinnamon, sometimes you need salt, whatever it is, but you need to have people that have strengths and knowledge banks that balance your own. And then maybe hopefully you can be that for them when they need your expertise. And that's really how I feel about it. I feel like I'm just, if I can make someone, have a sunny day instead of a stormy day at some point through something that I can offer, then, that's just paying it forward for all the times that people have done that for me. And that, that's really how I feel about it. I feel like it's a 10-way street.
I love that. Well, thank you for doing your part when it comes to that 10-way street. This podcast is called Unless because of the Dr. Seuss quote from the Lorax: unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. And so I just wanted to say thank you for being someone that cares so much, so deeply about what you do, the patients that you remember from when you were, in the geriatric ward. You remember those people and you've brought that with you into your work at Waud. You care deeply, I know, about the compliance officers in your portfolio companies. I know, just as that partner is so grateful to have you, you care about your partners, make sure they do have peace of mind. And I feel very cared about by you and your wider community. So thank you, Melanie.
Oh, thank you for having me. This is great. I really enjoyed chatting. As you we could just stay here for a couple more hours.
Right? Yeah.
And I get to ask you all the questions. Maybe that's a future episode.
Right. We'll do that. We'll do the reverse unless. But again, thank you for joining us. And yes, we'll have you back soon, one way or another.
Thanks, Hemma.